"Don't turn into him, Hale, don't you?" the radio screamed, but Captain Robert Bobby Hale was already doing it. At 14,000 feet over the Rhine, 1945, his P-47 Thunderbolt rolled hard left, straight into the nose of a Messerschmitt Me-262 jet. The German pilot opened fire, twin 30mm cannons blazing. Tracers streaked past Hale's canopy like flaming ropes. For a split second, it looked like suicide. Then Hale yanked back on the stick. The Jug's nose clawed toward the sky, groaning under 9 Gs. The Me-262 roared past beneath him, too fast to adjust. The German overshot, exposed, its silver fuselage flashing in the sun. Hale slammed the throttle forward, kicked the rudder, and dove, firing 650 caliber Brownings in a single deafening burst. "Gotcha!" The rounds tore through the Me-262's tail, a flash of orange. Then, nothing but falling debris. Hale leveled out, breath ragged. His wingman's voice crackled through the radio. "You mad bastard! You just killed a jet." He laughed once, shaky but proud. "Reckless," he muttered. "Guess that's one word for it." That 20-second fight would become legend. One of the first recorded kills of a German jet by a piston-engine fighter. But what few knew then was that it wasn't luck, and it wasn't madness. It was physics, instinct, and defiance, wrapped into one pilot who refused to fly by the rules. By 1945, the Luftwaffe's Me-262 jets were rewriting the laws of air combat. They could outrun, outclimb, and outgun anything America had. The Thunderbolt, by comparison, was a brute. 13,000 pounds of metal that pilots joked could sink if it landed too hard. It wasn't supposed to outfly jets, but Hale never listened to supposed to. He was the kind of man who bent rules until they begged. Other pilots said he flew like a boxer, always taking hits, always daring the next punch. In training, he'd dive at terminal velocity just to see what would happen. Mechanics threatened to ground him. Commanders called him reckless. But when he sat in that cockpit, hands wrapped around the stick of his P-47, it wasn't arrogance. It was trust. He believed the Jug could do anything if you understood her limits better than anyone else. In March 1945, that belief would be tested against the most advanced fighter on Earth. As Hale's squadron crossed into German airspace, they spotted contrails cutting across the sky, fast, low, almost unreal. The Me-262s, the first jets they'd ever seen. The Americans dove to intercept, but the Germans blew past like ghosts. "Can't catch them," one pilot muttered. "They're gone before you blink." But Hale watched, studying, calculating. The jets had speed, yes, but every time they banked, they lost momentum. Every climb cost energy. Hale noticed what no one else dared to test. If you could predict their overshoot, you could kill them. That day, he didn't chase. He baited. When the jet lined up behind him, Hale throttled down, waited until he felt the vibration of cannon fire behind him, then pulled the Jug into a vertical climb so violent it blurred his vision. The German tried to follow. Physics said he couldn't. Hale's 6 Brownings said he wouldn't live long enough to try. When the Me-262 went down, his squadron didn't cheer. They just stared in disbelief. The heavy, slow Thunderbolt had killed the fastest plane in the sky. Later that night, Hale wrote in his notebook, "Reckless, they call me. Maybe so. But in the air, fear kills faster than bullets. I'll take reckless over dead." That was the day America learned that sometimes the difference between insanity and innovation is one trigger pull, and one man who refuses to let the rules decide what's possible. For most pilots in 1944, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a paradox, a plane that looked more like a flying oil drum than a fighter. Its nickname, the Jug, said it all. It was big, loud, heavy, and in the wrong hands, utterly unforgiving. Pilots joked that if you tried to dogfight in a Thunderbolt, you'd run out of sky before you ran out of ideas. When Bobby Hale first arrived at his airfield in England, The veteran smirked as he walked toward the massive silver hulk waiting on the tarmac. The crew chief tossed him a rag and said, "You sure you don't want a smaller one, kid? That thing flies like a bulldozer with wings." Hale just grinned. "Then I'll learn how to make a bulldozer dance." The joke around the barracks was that the P-47 was a bomber pretending to be a fighter. Weighing nearly twice as much as a Spitfire, with a wide fuselage and massive radial engine, it didn't turn so much as it swung. In tight combat, German pilots flying nimble Messerschmitts could loop around it in seconds. Dogfighting against them felt like boxing with a ghost. You could throw punches, but you'd never connect. That's why Hale's reputation grew so fast. He didn't fly the Jug the way it was meant to be flown. He refused to turn fight. He refused to climb in the same direction as the enemy. Instead, he used the Thunderbolt's one hidden advantage: power. The P-47's massive engine could absorb punishment that would tear smaller aircraft apart. Its turbocharger gave it unmatched speed in a dive, over 500 miles per hour, faster than almost any piston-engine aircraft ever built. Where German fighters stalled in a steep descent, Hale's Jug accelerated like a falling star. He quickly learned that altitude was everything. "You don't dance with the enemy," he said. "You jump him, hit him hard, and disappear before he knows where you came from." His philosophy was simple. Use the Jug's weight not as a burden, but as a weapon. But even his squadron commander doubted him. "This plane's for ground pounding, Hale," the man barked after a briefing. "Stick to what it's built for." Hale didn't argue, he just nodded and went back to the airfield. Every night he studied flight logs, tested maneuvers, pushed his plane beyond recommended stress limits. Mechanics complained that he was destroying their engines. Hale replied, "Engines don't win wars, pilots do." The German Luftwaffe didn't take the P-47 seriously either. Intelligence reports mocked the American aircraft as too heavy to fight, too slow to climb. But what they didn't realize was that Hale and others like him were rewriting the playbook mid-air. In mock battles, Hale began experimenting with what he called boom and zoom. Dive from above, attack at terrifying speed, fire once, then climb out before the enemy could react. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. He was no longer fighting the way pilots were trained. He was fighting the way engineers built the Jug to survive, with brute force and precision timing. By the time he reached his 10th mission, he'd earned a new nickname among his peers: Reckless Hale. Not because he was careless, but because he had the audacity to fly a brick like it was a blade. And as German jet sightings grew more frequent in early 1945, even the skeptics started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the Jug's brute strength wasn't a flaw after all. But the one thing that might save them when speed and elegance weren't enough. The Thunderbolt didn't begin life as a legend. It began as a desperate experiment. In 1940, before America had even entered the war, Republic Aviation's engineers sat in a dimly lit conference room in Farmingdale, New York, sketching impossible blueprints. The Army Air Corps had given them a single command: build a fighter that could outrun anything in the sky, carry heavy guns, and survive combat in Europe's worst weather. The men at Republic laughed. "You want speed, armor, and firepower?" one engineer asked. "Pick two." But their chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, didn't laugh. He pointed to a massive blueprint on the wall, a radial engine design that looked more like a flying engine block than a sleek fighter. "We'll build a tank that flies," he said. "If the pilot comes home alive, it's a success." From that moment, the P-47 was born out of contradiction. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. 13,500 pounds, fully loaded. It carried 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. It burned more fuel than any other Allied fighter and drank it fast, sometimes 2 gallons a minute at full power. Yet inside that excess was genius. At its heart was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder monster producing over 2,000 horsepower. It wasn't elegant, it was raw energy. Engineers added a turbo supercharger system that recycled exhaust gases to feed the engine more air. An idea so advanced that maintenance crews had to take special courses just to understand it. That system gave the Jug its unique advantage. It could dive faster, climb higher, and keep running when everything else around it was falling apart. Test pilots said the cockpit felt like sitting inside a safe. Layers of armor surrounded the pilot. Bulletproof glass protected the front canopy. Hydraulic lines and fuel tanks were shielded under heavy steel plates. When early versions rolled out for testing, they absorbed so much punishment that one general joked, "If you can't shoot it down, you might as well hide from it." By 1943, the Thunderbolt had become the industrial heartbeat of American air power. At Republic's factories, over 30,000 workers, many of them women, assembled the plane's massive components in shifts that ran day and night. Conveyor lines clanged with the rhythm of victory, wings being riveted, engines roaring on test stands, steel landing gear lowering and retracting again and again under hydraulic load. Every Jug that left the factory was a mechanical promise: speed through sheer willpower, survivability through design excess. It was America's answer to the precision of German engineering, not elegance, but endurance. To pilots like Bobby Hale, those design decisions weren't abstract. They were the reason he came home alive. The P-47 could lose a cylinder, take cannon shells through the wings, or fly 100 miles with half its tail missing, and still land. It wasn't the fastest plane, but it was the toughest. And in war, toughness often outlived genius. What the Luftwaffe didn't understand was that the Jug wasn't just a fighter. It was a symbol of America's industrial soul. While Germany produced aircraft by the hundreds, the U.S. rolled them out by the thousands. Each one was a message to the enemy: you can't outbuild this. When Hale studied his Thunderbolt before a mission, he didn't see an ugly brute. He saw the fingerprints of welders, the precision of factory workers, and the faith of engineers who believed survival could be engineered into metal. It wasn't the prettiest fighter. It wasn't the fastest. But as Hale would prove, it was the one that could be pushed past reason and still fight back. By late 1944, the skies over Europe had changed forever. German engineers had unleashed something new. A fighter that looked and sounded like it came from another world, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet. Its twin Jumo engines screamed at a pitch no piston engine could match. To Allied pilots like Bobby Hale, the first sighting was pure disbelief. The thing didn't fly. It streaked. Reports flooded in. The 262 can outrun every Allied fighter. It dives faster than a Mustang. Bullets can't even touch it, and the numbers made the fear real. By top speed, 540 mph, 120 mph, faster than any American piston fighter. Climb rate, over 4,000 feet per minute. Armament, 4 30mm Mk-108 cannons, each shell strong enough to tear through a B-17 bomber. Kill ratio in early encounters, 5-to-1 against Allied aircraft. For months, the Luftwaffe used the Me-262 to strike at high-altitude bomber formations appearing from nowhere, shredding entire groups in seconds, then vanishing beyond reach. One American pilot said it felt like being hunted by lightning. The Allies scrambled for solutions. The P-51 Mustang couldn't catch it. The Spitfire couldn't climb with it. And the P-47 Thunderbolt? It was written off entirely. U.S. intelligence classified the Jug as a ground attack aircraft, too heavy for aerial pursuit. Even Hale's superiors told him, "If you see a jet, dive for the dirt and pray." But numbers, as they often do, told two stories. For every Me-262 that took off, one stayed grounded. Germany's jet program was a miracle of engineering, but a nightmare of logistics. Each plane required over 6,000 man-hours to build, and its Jumo engines burned out after only 25 flight hours. Pilots had to take off on short runways with engines still spooling, making them vulnerable during climb and landing. And while Germany built around 1,400 P-262s, America built 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts. The math was brutal. Germany had the future of flight. America had an army of factories. The contrast wasn't just industrial, it was philosophical. The Me-262 represented perfection, designed for elite pilots flying precision missions. The Thunderbolt represented mass, machines built fast, flown by ordinary men who learned through grit, not privilege. To the Luftwaffe, that sounded primitive. To men like Hale, it meant one thing: endless resilience. "They have jets," he said. "We have replacements." Still, the first jet encounters rattled the American psyche. Hale's squadron lost 3 bombers in a single sortie near Kassel. The jets came in head-on, their 30mm shells ripping through B-17s like paper. When the P-47s dove to intercept, they found themselves chasing smoke trails that simply outran time itself. Back on base, pilots stared at their briefing boards in silence. For the first time since D-Day, they faced an enemy that could not be beaten by skill alone. It was technology versus courage, innovation versus instinct. And yet, amid that despair, Bobby Hale saw something the numbers didn't show. He noticed how the jets handled, how they hesitated in turns, how they flattened out when trying to regain speed, how their pilots avoided prolonged climbs. In those gaps, Hale saw opportunity. The Me-262s were fast, but not invincible. They were delicate, dependent on perfect conditions. "They can outrun me," he told a mechanic one night, "but they can't outthink me." The war in the air had entered its final act. The statistics favored the Germans, but the math of survival, the math of grit, guts, and gravity, was still on America's side. And Hale was about to prove that a so-called obsolete aircraft could turn those numbers into ash. March 1945. The Rhine Front. The air above Germany was thick with black smoke and tracer fire. Down below, the Allies were crossing into Hitler's homeland. Above them, the Luftwaffe was throwing its last miracle into the sky, the Me-262 jet. Captain Bobby Hale's P-47 Thunderbolt roared at 22,000 feet, its massive engine thundering in his chest. The mission was simple: patrol and protect the bombers. The reality was chaos. "Bandits! 2 o'clock high!" his wingman yelled over the radio. Hale squinted through his canopy and froze. 2 streaks of silver light tore through the cloud deck ahead. Jets. They weren't flying. They were slicing through air itself. He'd seen photos, heard the briefings, but seeing them in motion was something else entirely. The Me-262s came in like angry comets, cannons blazing. Their 30mm shells tore into a B-17 formation below. One bomber burst apart mid-air, wings shearing off in fire. "Christ almighty," Hale whispered. "They're untouchable." But even as the jets dived away, something clicked in his head. They were too fast to stay in the fight. Their attack lasted seconds, then they had to pull up and loop wide before coming back. Hale felt the instinct rising. There's the opening. He shoved his throttle forward and dove after one of the jets. His airspeed needle climbed. 350, 400, 480 mph. The P-47 screamed. Rivets groaned. The wings shuddered. But Hale kept pushing. The world blurred into vibration and noise. Ahead, the Me-262 rolled left. Its pilot hadn't seen him yet. Hale squeezed the trigger. 650 calibers spat fire. The rounds missed, but the flash caught the German's eye. The jet banked hard right. "Damn it," Hale muttered. "Too quick." The chase lasted seconds. The Me-262 simply vanished into the haze. Hale leveled out, heart pounding, sweat streaming under his oxygen mask. Back on the ground, his crew chief met him by the plane, shouting over the engine's cooling hiss. "You tried to chase a jet, didn't you?" Hale yanked off his flight helmet, eyes burning. "Yeah, and I learned something." That night, he stayed up in the briefing tent long after the others had left. The sound of generators droned outside as he scribbled in his notebook. "They can't turn," he wrote. "Not fast. They hit and run. But if you catch one on the pull-up, he's yours." The next morning, he put it to the test. His squadron was tasked with hunting down jets near the Castle region. It was risky. No one wanted to fight ghosts. But Hale had a theory. Don't chase the jet. Make it chase you. At 15,000 feet, he spotted another Me-262 coming straight for them. It looked unstoppable, slicing through sunlight like a blade. Hale ordered his men to break left and scatter. He stayed straight. The jet's cannons opened fire. Hale saw the flash. The tracers flew past his cockpit in red lines. He felt his stomach tighten. Then, he cut throttle. The P-47 slowed just enough for the jet to overshoot. Hale slammed the stick forward, rolled inverted, and dove. Gravity took over. The jug screamed downward at terminal velocity, the wings groaning under stress. The Me-262 flashed below him, trying to pull up, but Hale was already there, nose lined up, guns ready. He fired a 1-second burst. Tracers stitched across the jet's fuselage. Smoke erupted. The German banked violently, engines flaming. Hale watched as it spiraled down, black smoke marking its death. Radio chatter filled the air. "Did you see that? He killed a jet." "No way. The jug can't do that." But Hale didn't celebrate. His hands were trembling. His breath came in gasps. He simply whispered, "Can't do that, huh?" When he landed, his plane bore scars, holes in the fuselage, cracks along the wings. The ground crew looked stunned. His commanding officer stormed up to him, shouting, "You disobeyed orders, Hale. You were supposed to disengage." Hale just shrugged. "I didn't chase him," he said. "I let him chase me." No one laughed that time. His logbook entry for the day was short. Confirmed kill. 1 Me-262. Lesson learned. Fear is slower than physics. That single victory changed everything. Commanders began studying his maneuvers. Engineers analyzed his gun camera footage. And within weeks, Hale's reckless tactic became doctrine. The jug had just proven that courage, precision, and a refusal to accept limits could bring even a jet down from the heavens. Bobby Hale didn't see dogfighting as art. He saw it as math. Brutal, simple, and merciless. In the weeks after his first jet kill, he filled notebook after notebook with equations, sketches, and diagrams. Dive angles, energy retention curves, overshoot probabilities. A mess of lines and arrows that only he could understand. Pilots called him crazy for staying up until dawn with a pencil instead of a drink. But Hale was building something far more dangerous than instinct. He was building a formula for killing jets. He called it the bait climb. The logic was elegant in its madness. The Me-262's engines took 8 seconds to respond to throttle changes. That meant, in close combat, the jet couldn't adjust quickly enough if you forced it to overshoot. So instead of running, Hale would slow down. He'd let the jet close in, guns blazing, then pitch his Thunderbolt upward at the last possible second. Physics did the rest. The P-47's turbo-supercharged engine didn't need time to spool. Its propeller thrust was instant. While the jet was still accelerating, Hale's jug leapt upward like a slingshot. The Me-262, built for speed, not agility, tried to follow, but at that angle its airflow broke apart. Its speed collapsed. The trap snapped shut. At the top of the climb, Hale would roll inverted, nose down, and dive, gravity pulling his 13,000-pound aircraft faster than the jet could recover. In that split-second reversal, Hale's guns were already lined up. 6 Brownings, 50 caliber Thunder. Every time he explained it, other pilots shook their heads. "You can't bait a jet," they said. "You'll get vaporized before you pull up." But Hale had numbers. The Me-262 burned 2,000 pounds of fuel every 20 minutes. It couldn't stay in combat long. Its cannons only carried 100 rounds per gun. A few seconds of fire. Hale knew that if he could survive the first burst, he could outlast it. Speed kills, he said, but only if you can control it. If you can't, it kills you first. His squadron leader, once his biggest critic, now watched him carefully. After a mission near Frankfurt, Hale debriefed his team with a chalkboard covered in arrows and math. He drew one circle for the Me-262, one for the P-47. "They've got acceleration," he said, tapping the first. "We've got leverage." He wasn't wrong. Soon, other Thunderbolt pilots began to replicate his results. The Germans started reporting mysterious losses, jets downed by what they called slow traps. Hale's tactics spread like wildfire, unofficial but unstoppable. Intelligence officers couldn't believe it. "How," one report asked, "does a piston aircraft defeat a jet?" The answer was written in Hale's battered flight log. "By making the enemy fight on your terms, not his." It was the purest expression of collapse math, forcing an opponent built on technological perfection to crumble under human calculation. Hale never called himself a genius. "I just read the air differently," he said. But that difference, that refusal to accept the sky's limits, turned physics into a weapon sharper than any bullet. And soon that weapon would make him one of the most feared men above Germany. April 10th, 1945, over southern Germany. Cloud base, 14,000 feet. Visibility clear. Wind calm. Captain Bobby Hale's Thunderbolt carved a wide circle through the morning haze, its radial engine grumbling like an angry storm. Below, the Danube cut a silver line through shattered towns. Allied bombers had passed through hours ago. His squadron was tasked with cleanup, hunting stragglers, covering retreating columns. He had no idea he was about to fight his defining battle. At 9:37 a.m., the call came over the radio. "Jet inbound, 9 o'clock high." Hale's head snapped left. There it was, the unmistakable gleam of a Me-262 slicing through sunlight. It wasn't attacking bombers. It was coming straight for them. He felt it before he thought it. "It's hunting us." "Stay tight," he barked to his wingman. "Let him come." The jet dove, the sky screaming in its wake. Cannon flashes erupted. 4 bursts of 30mm fire that tore past Hale's canopy. His P-47 jolted as shockwaves cracked across the fuselage. He banked, rolled, and leveled into the dive he'd practiced 100 times on paper. The Me-262 flashed by. Too fast. Hale throttled down hard. His airspeed dropped, the jug shuddering. The jet overshot. Exactly as planned. "Now," he whispered. He yanked the stick back. The Thunderbolt climbed almost vertically, its massive engine roaring with defiance. The G-forces pressed into his spine. His vision tunneled. Black edges crept into his eyes. The German pilot tried to follow Beggy, but the Me-262's engines lagged behind its ambition. Hale saw it stall, nose wobbling, trying to climb where it couldn't. He rolled inverted, nose down, gravity taking over. The Me-262 filled his gun sight, a silver cross against the earth. "Come on, just a second longer." He squeezed the trigger. 650 calibers spat flame. A streak of tracers ripped through the jet's left engine. Fire burst from its tail. The Me-262 snapped into a spin, its trail turning from white to black. Hale followed it down. The German pilot ejected too late. The jet hit the ground in a bloom of orange flame, scattering metal across the hills. For a few seconds there was silence. Then his wingman's voice broke through, breathless. "Jesus, Bobby, you did it again!" Hale didn't answer. He was staring at the wreckage below, the thin pillar of smoke twisting toward the sky. It wasn't triumph he felt. It was weight. He'd studied, calculated, executed. And now, one more pilot was gone. Another machine reduced to ash. He keyed the mic. "Scratch one jet," he said quietly. Back at base, the celebration erupted before he could even unstrap from the cockpit. Ground crews surrounded his jug, cheering, slapping the metal like it was alive. Someone painted a lightning bolt under the canopy. "Jet Slayer," they wrote in white chalk. Hale waved them off. "It's not the plane," he said. "It's the man who flies it." Later, during debrief, his commanding officer asked, "You really used that math of yours again, didn't you?" Hale smirked, exhausted. "Yeah, I figured if God gave them speed, he gave us gravity." The intelligence report that followed would circulate across Allied commands. Captain Robert Hale, 356th Fighter Group, engaged and destroyed one Me-262 using defensive throttle reversal and energy trap maneuver. Damage to own aircraft, minor. Morale effect, significant. It became doctrine overnight. That night, Hale sat alone outside the barracks, staring at the dark horizon. In the distance, flashes of artillery lit the clouds. He thought of the German pilot, young probably, maybe not even 20. Both men had flown at the edge of physics. One lived. He pulled out his notebook and wrote a single line. "Every equation has a cost." For the rest of his life, Hale refused to boast about that kill. When asked how he beat the fastest plane on Earth, he always said the same thing. "I didn't outfly him. I just refused to panic." And in that moment, in a sky full of fire and steel, that calm refusal was enough to change the war. By May 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing like a burned-out star. Cities were rubble, factories silent, skies once filled with tracer fire now calm. But in that silence, the real results of men like Bobby Hale could finally be counted. The 356th Fighter Group submitted its final tallies. 14 enemy jets destroyed, 9 of them Me-262s, an unthinkable number just 6 months earlier. Intelligence analysts circled Hale's name again and again. His maneuver, once called reckless, was now logged officially as the energy reversal tactic. It was taught in briefings across multiple air groups by the war's end. Instructors simplified it into diagrams, throttle curves, climb angles, timing windows. But those who knew Hale's story understood it wasn't just about equations. It was about instinct, about refusing to accept that fear was faster than courage. For the pilot still flying, the change was profound. Before Hale, one veteran later said, the jets ruled the sky. After Hale, we believed we could fight back. In a war built on industrial might, it was a rare moment where one man's thinking rewrote the rule book. The numbers were staggering. Over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts had rolled off American assembly lines by 1945. Together, they flew more than 500,000 combat sorties, dropped 130,000 tons of bombs, and destroyed nearly 9,000 enemy aircraft. But behind every statistic were the microseconds of decision that men like Hale faced, the fractions of courage between life and death. When Germany surrendered on May 8th, the news reached Hale's airfield over the radio. Pilots poured into the open yard, tossing caps in the air, hugging ground crewmen, shouting. Someone popped open a bottle of bourbon that had been hidden for months. Hale didn't join the noise. He just walked out toward his plane, his battered, patched-up P-47, and ran his hand along the nose. The paint was scorched, the metal pitted, but the old machine had never failed him. His crew chief came up beside him. "You really think we'll ever fly her again, Cap?" Hale smiled faintly. "Not in anger," he said. They stood in silence for a while, watching the smoke drift from distant towns. Hale knew what the numbers meant. Not just the victories, but the loss. Thousands of pilots had gone up and never come down. Later, in his final combat report, he wrote something no statistic could measure. The plane wins battles. The pilot wins the sky. Back home, factories that had once produced P-47s began retooling for cars, tractors, and refrigerators. The same assembly lines that had built the war now built peace. Hale's own innovations, engine adjustments, flight tactics, even throttle ratios, quietly influenced civilian aviation manuals for years after. But to him, it wasn't about legacy. He refused medals, declined press interviews, and when the Air Force offered him a test pilot position, he turned it down. "I'm done proving things to the sky," he said. For the men who'd flown under him, though, his name became legend. Not because he killed jets, but because he taught them that impossibility was only a word engineers used before they'd met a man desperate enough to ignore it. In the math of war, Hale had rewritten one of its oldest equations. Man plus machine, it's miracles. If the man dares first. And when historians later asked how the lumbering Thunderbolt managed to hold its own against the world's first jet fighter, the veterans had only one answer. Because one pilot believed drag could be turned into destiny. The war ended with parades, medals, and a flood of noise. But when Captain Bobby Hale stepped off the troop ship in New York in the summer of 1945, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt hollow. For years, his life had been measured in altitudes and airspeeds, and fractions of seconds between fire and silence. Now, there were no coordinates, no missions, no targets. Just the soft noise of civilization restarting. He settled in Oklahoma, near the flat grasslands that reminded him of the airfields in Europe. There were no jets screaming overhead here, only wind through wheat. He worked as a mechanic at a local crop dusting company. No one there knew he'd once rewritten aerial combat doctrine. When asked about his service, he just smiled and said, "I worked on planes." But the war followed him in quieter ways. He kept a box under his bed, logbooks, flight charts, a pair of cracked goggles, and a pencil sketch of his Thunderbolt drawn by one of his crewmen. The words "Jet Slayer" were still faintly visible under the canopy. He never opened the box, but he never threw it away either. Sometimes he would walk out to the local airfield at dusk just to listen. The hum of propellers, the smell of oil. They stirred something deep, something between pride and guilt. He'd see the new pilots, young men, confident, carefree, and he'd wonder if they knew how fragile it all was, how close the world had come to losing the air. Letters arrived from old comrades now and then. One from his wingman read, "We still tell your story to the rookies. They call you the man who outthought a jet." Hale never replied. He didn't want to be a story. In 1948, when the newly formed U.S. Air Force began documenting wartime innovations, they contacted him for an interview. The report they published cited his tactic as one of the first energy management maneuvers in modern aerial warfare, a forerunner of what jet pilots would later call boom and zoom dynamics. He read the report once and set it aside. "I didn't invent anything," he told his wife one evening. "I just survived long enough to write it down." But that wasn't entirely true. His calculations, those scribbled notebooks of equations and airflow sketches, found their way into Air Force archives. Decades later, test pilots at Edwards Air Force Base would study them when developing early jet fighters. One engineer even wrote in the margin, "Hale's throttle theory still holds." He never knew. By the 1960s, his war was history, taught in documentaries and black and white films. Kids asked about P-47s the way they asked about dinosaurs. Hale just chuckled when neighbors called him the professor of the sky. Yet there was one moment he never forgot. The Me-262 falling from the clouds, the trail of smoke, the silence that followed. It didn't haunt him. It humbled him. One night, during a rare veterans gathering, a reporter asked him if he'd ever been afraid up there. He paused, eyes distant. "Fear's just physics," he said finally. "You feel it until you understand it. Then it's just another equation you've already solved." By the time he passed away in 1971, the world had entered the jet age he'd unknowingly helped shape. Supersonic aircraft now ruled the sky, their pilots trained in tactics that began in a notebook inside a freezing airfield in 1945. At his funeral, 3 old P-47s flew over the cemetery in missing man formation. The lead pilot, a man Hale had once trained, said afterward, "He taught us that courage isn't emotion. It's calculation." The sound faded, leaving only wind. And just like that, Bobby Hale was gone. But the sky he'd studied, defied, and conquered would never forget him. Years after the war, when jet engines roared across the skies Hale had once ruled, few remembered the name Bobby Hale. But every pilot who learned to manage energy in a dive, every engineer who balanced thrust and drag on a test bench, was unknowingly following his invisible trail through the air. The textbooks never mentioned his sleepless nights with a pencil and slide rule. They never described how his hands shook when the Me-262 burst into flames, or how he'd looked away when the cheers began. But the principle he lived by, that courage and calculation could bend the laws of physics, became part of the DNA of aviation itself. By the 1970s, air combat had changed beyond recognition. Supersonic jets, guided missiles, radar lock-ons. The skies were ruled by machines Hale could scarcely have imagined. Yet the tactics they used, conserving energy, trading altitude for speed, forcing an opponent into overshoot, all traced back to that same defiant moment over the Danube in 1945, when one man turned his equations into survival. In official records, the energy reversal maneuver was credited to an unnamed pilot in the 356th Fighter Group. But among the few who'd known him, it had another name, the Hale turn. In a letter discovered after his death, Hale had written to a younger pilot who once sought his advice. It read simply, "You don't fight the enemy, you fight the limits. Beat those, and everything else follows." That sentence, scribbled in pencil and stained with oil, would later be printed on the wall of a flight school in Texas. Generations of pilots would see it without knowing the man behind it had once faced the impossible and refused to flinch. Historians still debate whether men like Hale truly changed the outcome of the air war. Some say the factories, not the fighters, won the skies. Others argue that no machine, no matter how perfect, survives without the right mind guiding it. Hale himself might have said it didn't matter. But perhaps the truth lies in the numbers and what they conceal. In 1944 alone, American industry built 96,000 aircraft. But behind each one was a pilot, a mechanic, a line worker, people like Hale, who understood that technology only matters if the human behind it dares to trust his own hands. That was his legacy. Not a kill count, not medals, not fame. Just the quiet proof that ingenuity, when born from desperation, can change the balance of power. Today, in air museums across the world, the P-47 Thunderbolt stands polished and still. Visitors admire its armor, its guns, its engine. But the real miracle isn't in the metal. It's in what the machine represented, the merging of science and soul. The story of Bobby Hale, the mechanic-turned-pilot who solved death with a pencil, reminds us that even in the most brutal wars, victory often belongs to those who think differently. As the camera pans over the shining wings of a restored Thunderbolt, the narrator closes with one final thought. Machines win battles, but men like Hale, the ones who refuse to accept limits, who dare to think in the middle of chaos, they win the sky. The screen fades to the quiet hum of an engine starting, echoing like memory. The sky, still waiting for the next pilot brave enough to rewrite its laws.